The Danger Trail by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 1. The Girl of the Snows. For perhaps the first time in his life Howland felt the spirit of romance, of adventure, of sympathy for the picturesque and the unknown surging through his veins. A billion stars glowed like yellow, passionless eyes in the polar cold of the skies. Behind them, white in its sinuous twisting through the snow-smothered wilderness, lay the icy Saskatchewan, with a few scattered lights visible where Prince Albert, the last outpost of civilization, came down to the river half a mile away. But it was into the north that Howland looked. From the top of the great ridge which he had climbed, he gazed steadily into the white gloom which reached for 1,000 miles from where he stood to the Arctic Sea. Faintly in the grim silence of the winter night there came to his ears the soft hissing sound of the aurora borealis, as it played in its age-old song over the dome of the earth, and as he watched the cold flashes shooting like pale arrows through the distant sky, and listened to its whispering music of unending loneliness and mystery, there came on him a strange feeling that it was beckoning to him and calling to him, telling him that up there, very near to the end of the earth, lay all that he had dreamed of and hoped for since he had grown old enough to begin the shaping of a destiny of his own. He shivered as the cold nipped at his blood, and lighted a fresh cigar, half turning to shield himself from a wind that was growing out of the east. As the match flared in the cup of his hands, for an instant there came from the black gloom of the balsam and spruce at his feet a wailing, hungerful cry that brought a startled breath from his lips. It was a cry such as Indian dogs make about the teepees of masters who are newly dead. He had never heard such a cry before, and yet he knew that it was a wolf's. It impressed him with an awe which was new to him, and he stood as motionless as the trees about him, until, from out of the gray night gloom to the west, there came an answering cry, and then, from far to the north, still another. "Sounds as though I'd better go back to town," he said to himself, speaking aloud. "By George, but it's lonely." He descended the ridge, walked rapidly over the hard crust of the snow across the Saskatchewan, and assured himself that he felt considerably easier when the lights of Prince Albert gleamed a few hundred yards ahead of him. Jack Howland was a Chicago man, which means that he was a hustler and not overburdened with sentiment. For 15 of his 31 years he had been hustling. Since he could easily remember he had possessed to a large measure but one ambition and one hope. With a persistence which had left him peculiarly a stranger to the more frivolous and human sides of life, he had worked toward the achievement of this ambition, and tonight, because that achievement was very near at hand, he was happy. He had never been happier. There flashed across his mental vision a swiftly moving picture of the fight he had made for success. It had been a magnificent fight. Without vanity, he was proud of it, for fate had handicapped him at the beginning, and still he had won out. He saw himself again the homeless little farmer boy setting out from his Illinois village to take up life in a great city. As though it had all happened but yesterday, he remembered how for days and weeks he had nearly starved, how he had sold papers at first, and then, by lucky chance, became errand boy in a big drafting establishment. It was there that the ambition was born in him. He saw great engineers come and go, men who were greater than presidents to him, and who sought out the ends of the earth in the following of their vocation. He made a slave of himself in the nurturing and strengthening of his ambition to become one of them, to be a builder of railroads and bridges, a tunneler of mountains, a creator of new things in new lands. His slavery had not lessened as his years increased. Voluntarily he had kept himself in bondage, fighting ceaselessly the obstacles in his way, triumphing over his handicaps as few other men had triumphed, rising, slowly, steadily, resistlessly, until now. He flung back his head and the pulse of his heart quickened as he heard again the words of Van Horn, president of the greatest engineering company on the continent. "Howland, we've decided to put you in charge of the building of the Hudson Bay Railroad. It's one of the wildest jobs we've ever had, and Gregson and Thorne don't seem to catch on. They're bridge builders and not wilderness men. We've got to lay a single line of steel through 300 miles of the wildest country in North America, and from this hour your motto is 'Do it or bust.' You can report at Le Pas as soon as you get your traps together." Those words had broken the slavedom for Howland. He had been fighting for an opportunity, and now that the opportunity had come he was sure that he would succeed. Swiftly, with his hands thrust deep in his pockets, he walked down the one main street of Prince Albert, puffing out odorous clouds of smoke from his cigar, every fiber in him tingling with the new joy that had come into his life. Another night would see him in Le Pas, the little outpost 60 miles farther east on the Saskatchewan. Then 100 miles by dog sledge, and he would be in the big wilderness camp where 300 men were already at work clearing a way to the great bay to the north. What a glorious achievement that road would be! It would remain for all time as a cenotaph to his ability, his courage and indomitable persistence. It was past 9 o'clock when Howland entered the little old Windsor Hotel. The big room, through the windows of which he could look out on the street and across the frozen Saskatchewan, was almost empty. The clerk had locked his cigar case and had gone to bed. In one corner, partly shrouded in gloom, sat a half-breed trapper who had come in that day from the Lac la Ronge country, and at his feet crouched one of his wolfish sledge dogs. Both were wide awake and stared curiously at Howland as he came in. In front of the two large windows sat half a dozen men, as silent as the half-breed, clad in moccasins and thick caribou skin coats. One of them was the factor from a Hudson Bay post at Lac Bain, who had not been down to the edge of civilization for 3 years. The others, including 2 Crees and a Chippewayan, were hunters and postmen who had driven in their furs from 100 miles to the north. For a moment Howland paused in the middle of the room and looked about him. Ordinarily he would have liked this quiet, and would have gone to one of those 2 rude tables to write a letter or work out a problem of some sort, for he always carried a pocketful of problems about with him. His 15 years of study and unceasing slavery to his ambition had made him naturally as taciturn as these grim men of the north, who were born to silence. But tonight there had come a change over him. He wanted to talk. He wanted to ask questions. He longed for human companionship, for some kind of mental exhilaration beyond that furnished by his own thoughts. Feeling in his pocket for a cigar, he seated himself before one of the windows and proffered it to the factor from Lac Bain. "You smoke?" he asked companionably. "I was born in a wigwam," said the factor slowly, taking the cigar. "Thank you." "Deuced polite for a man who hasn't seen civilization for 3 years," thought Howland, seating himself comfortably, with his feet on the window sill. Aloud he said: "The clerk tells me you are from Lac Bain. That's a good distance north, isn't it?" 400 miles, replied the factor with quiet terseness. "We're on the edge of the Barren Lands." "Whew!" Howland shrugged his shoulders. Then he volunteered: "I'm going north myself tomorrow." "Postman?" "No, engineer. I'm putting through the Hudson Bay Railroad." He spoke the words quite clearly, and as they fell from his lips, the half-breed, partly concealed in the gloom behind him, straightened with the alert quickness of a cat. He leaned forward eagerly, his black eyes gleaming, and then rose softly from his seat. His moccasined feet made no sound as he came up behind Howland. It was the big husky who first gave a sign of his presence. For a moment the upturned eyes of the young engineer met those of the half-breed. That look gave Howland a glimpse of a face which he could never forget, a thin, dark, sensitive face framed in shining, jet-black hair, and a pair of eyes that were the most beautiful he had ever seen in a man. Sometimes a look decides great friendship or bitter hatred between men, and something, nameless, unaccountable, passed between these two. Not until the half-breed had turned and was walking swiftly away did Howland realize that he wanted to speak to him, to grip him by the hand, to know him by name. He watched the slender form of the northerner, as lithe and as graceful in its movement as a wild thing of the forests, until it passed from the door out into the night. "Who was that?" he asked, turning to the factor. "His name is Croisset. He comes from the Wholdaia country, beyond Lac la Ronge." "French?" "Half French, half Cree." The factor resumed his steady gaze out into the white distance of the night, and Howland gave up his effort at conversation. After a little his companion shoved back his chair and bade him good night. The Crees and Chippewayan followed him, and a few minutes later the two white hunters left the engineer alone before the windows. "Mighty funny people," he said half aloud. "Wonder if they ever talk." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, his face resting in his hands, and stared to catch a sign of moving life outside. In him there was no desire for sleep. Often he had called himself a night bird, but seldom had he been more wakeful than on this night. The elation of his triumph, of his success, had not yet worn itself down to a normal and reasoning satisfaction, and his chief longing was for the day, and the day after that, and the next day, when he would take the place of Gregson and Thorne. Every muscle in his body was vibrant in its desire for action. He looked at his watch. It was only 10 o'clock. Since supper he had smoked almost ceaselessly. Now he lighted another cigar and stood up close to one of the windows. Faintly he caught the sound of a step on the boardwalk outside. It was a light, quick step, and for an instant it hesitated, just out of his vision. Then it approached, and suddenly the figure of a woman stopped in front of the window. How she was dressed Howland could not have told a moment later. All that he saw was the face, white in the white night, a face on which the shimmering starlight fell as it was lifted to his gaze, beautiful, as clear-cut as a cameo, with eyes that looked up at him half pleadingly, half luringly, and lips parted, as if about to speak to him. He stared, moveless in his astonishment, and in another breath the face was gone. With a hurried exclamation he ran across the empty room to the door and looked down the starlit street. To go from the window to the door took him but a few seconds, yet he found the street deserted, deserted except for a solitary figure 3 blocks away, and a dog that growled at him as he thrust out his head and shoulders. He heard no sound of footsteps, no opening or closing of a door. Only there came to him that faint, hissing music of the northern skies. And once more, from the black forest beyond the Saskatchewan, the infinite sadness of the wolf howl. End of chapter 1. Recording by Roger Moline.